Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. In this video, I'm going to be covering chapters 10 and 11 of the book, and we will also be beginning part 3 of the book, which is titled Revolution, the Christian Invention of the Human. So let's get started with chapter 10, which is titled The Great Rebellion. The chapter opens with a lengthy reflection on how momentous and life-changing the rite of baptism was during the early decades of the Christian church. Unlike today, when most Christians are baptized as babies or children, and it's viewed as just sort of a rote, symbolic ritual that just goes with the territory. If you're a Christian and you're involved in the church, you get baptized, and it's not really that big of a deal. Back then, baptism was viewed as a very important, life-changing ritual. It was seen as the rejection of the sinful, fallen, pagan world and the acceptance of a new life and the new world of God that was made possible by Christ. It was seen not in symbolic terms, but in literal terms. You were being baptized and transformed. Hart says, quote, "However greatly tempted we may be to view beliefs of this sort as either touchingly quaint or savagely superstitious, depending on the degree to which we deceive ourselves that our vision of reality surpasses all others in sanity, we should recall that in late antiquity practically no one doubted that there was a sacral order to the world, or that the social, the political, the cosmic, and the religious realms of human existence were always inextricably involved with one another. Well, I don't think it's a matter of deceiving ourselves that our vision of reality surpasses all others in sanity, which I agree should be guarded against. It's possible to regard the beliefs people of a less educated or enlightened era had about the world and their place in it as superstitious or poorly informed compared to modern views, while remaining humble and mindful of how little or how much we modern folks still have to learn. You can have both thoughts. You can regard the beliefs of an earlier era as being quaint or superstitious while not getting super cocky about your own beliefs and your own level of knowledge. It's possible to do both. But anyway, pagans of this era, of this late antiquity era, viewed Christians as subversive, perverse, and referred to them sometimes as atheists, because they had rejected the commonly accepted gods in favor of their own. They did not believe in the gods that the pagan authorities or the common society believed counted as gods. One of the earliest critics of Christianity from this era, Celsus, seemed, in Hart's estimation, to recognize something special and, to his pagan sensibilities, very threatening about the growing Christian church. Hart says, quote, "It is unlikely that Celsus would have thought the Christians worth his notice had he not recognized something uniquely dangerous lurking in their gospel of love and peace. What clearly and genuinely horrified Celsus about this particular superstition was not its predictable vulgarity, but the novel spirit of rebellion that permeated its teachings. He continually speaks of Christianity as a form of sedition or rebellion, and what he principally condemns is its defiance of the immemorial religious customs of the world's tribes, cities, and nations." The actual writings of Celsus have not survived. As Hart acknowledges in this chapter, the only fragments we have of Celsus's writings today are found in quotations and paraphrases by Origen, who was a leader of the 2nd century Christian church, who wrote a response to Celsus several decades after Celsus had originally written his critique of Christianity. But that doesn't seem to be that big of a problem, since Origen's treatment of Celsus seems to be generally regarded as fair. So we don't have a complete picture of what Celsus wrote. We don't have a comprehensive sense of his feelings and responses to Christianity, but the fragments that we do have don't seem to have been significantly distorted by Origen. What bothers me about what Hart does here is the way he again presumes to know what Celsus must have been thinking as he wrote his critiques of Christianity. Let me remind you, as I did in the previous video of this series, that Hart doesn't like it when modern writers presume to know what was in the hearts and minds of Christians who lived centuries ago. In chapter 3 of the book, Hart took Jacques Le Goff to task for questioning the purity of the motives that compelled Christians hundreds of years ago to care for the sick and the poor. Wouldn't it only be fair to take these Christians at their word and assume that they were moved to their acts of kindness and charity out of genuine concern for the bodies and souls of the suffering, rather than attach less flattering motives? This was Hart's point against Le Goff in that earlier chapter. Why then does Hart presume to know the true motives behind Celsus's criticism of Christianity? When Hart writes of what Celsus would have thought about Christianity had he not recognized it as something unique, he's overlaying his own view of Christianity on that expressed by Celsus. Hart views Christianity as something new and special and revolutionary, a radical departure from the religions of the time that would go on to change the course of Western history. So naturally, Celsus must have viewed it this way too. Celsus must have detected this radical, unprecedented, revolutionary element in Christianity, because why else would he have bothered writing so much about it? The thing is, there's no need for such self-serving speculation. Celsus, in the bits of his work that survive through the quotations and summaries by Origen, makes it quite clear what his problems are with Christianity and why he is writing about it. And in fact, Hart references these problems himself in that quotation I read to you a moment ago. Intellectually, Celsus found the Christian concept of God to be nonsensical and contradictory. He objected to the false history of the faith that Christians had invented for themselves, where they called their faith an ancient one that had, existed since the creation of the world, when Celsus knew damn well that it had emerged from Judaism relatively recently and was not this ancient, timeless thing that Christians said it was. Celsus viewed Christians in general terms as being incurious people, as preferring blind faith over questions and evidence, and Celsus disliked what he saw as the church's predatory and opportunistic proselytizing of the poor and the uneducated, because he felt that the main reason why Christians directed their evangelism efforts toward the poor and the uneducated is because those were the only people who were gullible enough to buy the story that the Christians were selling. Politically speaking, and this is the bit that Hart touched on in his quotation that I shared with you, Celsus viewed Christians as traitors to Rome because they rejected the state religion and they refused to participate in the legally required observances and sacrifices. And Celsus was also concerned that Christianity had emerged from the Jewish community, which had a history of rebelling against Roman authority. So from the perspective of a citizen of the Roman Empire who respected and sought to preserve the authority of that state, the objections of Celsus to Christianity seem pretty straightforward and reasonable. Now, to my modern secular sensibilities, the notion that any group of people, including Christians, would be persecuted for not following a state-mandated religion is intolerable. But to Celsus, this clearly was a major issue. He disliked Christians and wrote against them because they opposed the religion and the government of Rome. He considered them to be divisive and threatening to peace and stability within the Roman Empire, and on top of that, he found the historical and factual claims upon which their faith was based to be preposterous and false. Having all of these facts, knowing all of this from Celsus's own writings as transmitted to us through Origen, why is it necessary to add that Celsus must have felt that Christianity was uniquely threatening to the social order in some way that no other cult had ever been before? Why is it necessary to insist that Celsus recognized Christianity as something radical and unprecedented? For Hart, these additions are necessary because he considers Christianity to have been something radical and unprecedented. But Celsus seems to have viewed Christianity as just another troublesome bunch of superstitious would-be separatists. And the reason that he devoted so much attention to them at the time was probably because they were the most prominent of these groups within his society. They were making the most noise, causing the most trouble, getting the most attention, so Celsus directed his critiques and his attacks their way. I see no reason to attempt to read his mind, especially if we're respecting Hart's earlier admonition to avoid doing that very thing. And I believe the reason why Hart is ignoring his own admonition and attempting or presuming to read Celsus's mind and tell us what informed his opposition to Christianity is that Hart is doing the same thing that Christian apologists often do, that they have done in many of the past books that I have reviewed in this format. He is exaggerating the importance and the exceptionalism of Christianity. He is treating Christianity as though it is something unique and special and unprecedented and without peer, because to him that's what it is. He refuses to accept that Christianity in its early days was one cult among many, and that as Christianity grew and became a powerful organized religion, it showed itself to be really no different in any real fundamental sense than any other organized religion that had ever grown to great prominence and great authority. Part of his narrative is that there's something radical and world-changing and otherworldly about Christianity, something about Christianity that we wouldn't expect from a human-created institution. But there's really no reason to believe that. There's no reason to regard Christianity as being any of those things, or to look at Christianity and reach the conclusion that it must be this divinely inspired institution. It just isn't. It's clearly a human-made institution, despite the special status that Hart and many other Christian apologists have attempted to attach to it. Anyway, Hart moves on to address the charge that Christianity was less tolerant than the more open-minded and pluralistic Roman pagans. We should not confuse Rome's polytheism for pluralism, he says. While Rome tolerated a diversity of cults that worshipped the many pagan gods, it was not very tolerant of religions other than the officially sanctioned compulsory paganism of the state. Hart says, quote, "The larger Indo-European and Near Eastern pagan world was often quite welcoming within reason of new gods, but only so long as those gods were recognizably inhabitants of a familiar mythic and religious universe. In this sense, and in this sense only, was the greater Roman world religiously tolerant. It was tolerant of creeds that were simply different expressions of its own religious temper, and that were, in consequence, easily absorbed. It was tolerant, that is to say, of what it found tolerable." A bit later in this chapter, Hart acknowledges that Christians also engaged in persecution of people who followed religions that they found intolerable, including Jews, who followed the religion to which Christianity owed its own existence. His point, so far, doesn't seem to be that Christianity is more tolerant of religious pluralism than pagan Rome, but that it isn't less tolerant, that pagans and Christians are about equally intolerant of other religions. Sort of an I might not be better than you, but you're definitely not better than me argument. I do note, however, that whenever Hart acknowledges the intolerance and oppression of others by Christians, he makes sure to attribute it partially to the society to which Christianity found itself attached, and to assert the overall superiority of Christian morality in principle, regardless of how those principles may have been disregarded from time to time by individual Christians or by the Christian institutions themselves. So yeah, I kind of think he is saying Christianity is better, because even when he acknowledges the shortcomings of Christians or Christian institutions, he's always quick with an excuse or quick with a mitigating circumstance. Hart says that the Christianization of Rome was not merely the exchanging of one religion for another. It was, in his words, a cosmic sedition and the invention of an entirely new universe of human possibilities, moral, social, intellectual, cultural, and religious. That's a quote from Hart. So there's a little bit of that exaggeration of the importance of Christianity I mentioned a moment ago. But don't let me leave you with the impression that Hart has no appreciation for the religion of pagan Rome. Quite the contrary. Quote, "None of which is to deny that many pagans were sincerely devoted to the gods. Much that was lovely, consoling, and ennobling attached to their worship, some of which the church would appropriate for itself in later centuries. But the benignity of their role, such as it was, is visible to us now only because they were put in their place centuries ago by the triumph of Christian atheism." Just as I was at the end of the previous video in this series, I'm struck by Hart's lack of self-awareness. He doesn't seem to realize how one might view his Christianity in exactly the same way as he views the paganism of Rome. Just as he views paganism as having been put in its place by Christianity, I and many other secular folks of the modern era tend to view Christianity, at least institutional Christianity, organized Christianity, as having been put in its place to an extent, and not without a long struggle to be sure, but put in its place nonetheless by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Hart gushes endlessly about the unprecedented moral and spiritual possibilities opened up by the advent of Christianity, but I can't help but notice how poorly the rest of the world was often treated by Christendom for centuries prior to the modern era. Imperialism, colonialism, transatlantic slavery, these all continued well into the post-Enlightenment era, to be sure, and we still aren't completely free of them or their consequences to this day. But they all began while Europe remained subject to the supposedly divine superior authority of the Christian Church. The authority that we should trust above the secular state authorities because it could command not merely our bodies but our immortal souls, according to Hart. It seems to me that the slow but certain dismantling and casting aside of practices of large-scale exploitation like colonialism and slavery, and the gradual, still insufficient but ongoing evolution of society toward acceptance, inclusion, and equality are due not to people adhering to the authority of the church, any church, but to people revising how they understood the role of both the church and the state in their lives, their responsibilities to each other, and their society's proper relationship to other societies in the world. The church tells us that morality is something static, that has never changed and will never change. That is obviously not the case. Even the church itself has changed over the centuries, and for the better, becoming more modern, more inclusive, more tolerant, more accepting of science. For the most part, the church has made these changes. There are some stubborn pockets of conservatism and orthodoxy that remain, but overall, the church has evolved in this more progressive direction over the last several centuries. How people of faith understand their religion and its roles in their lives and in their communities has changed a great deal in the last 300 years or so, along with every other element of our civilization. There are those within the church, including David Bentley Hart, it seems, who would like to deny that this change has taken place, who would rather view the moral evolution of society, to the extent that they consider that evolution to be a good thing, as the secular world catching up to where the religious world has always called it to be. But the truth is the other way around. Institutions, including religious ones, are usually much slower to embrace change than the general public. In other words, to make a long and much too verbose story a little shorter, it's society that evolves and pulls its institutions, including its religious institutions, into the future, not the other way around. The church is a product of society, not an independent entity, and as such, it owes far more to the society to which it belongs than the society owes to it. Hart's pomposity to be damned. Now, that's the end of chapter 10. Let's start chapter 11, which is titled A Glorious Sadness. so named because it describes how I feel when I read the book. Nah, I'm just kidding. There's nothing glorious about it. So why was Christianity able to survive, grow, and eventually supplant Roman paganism as the dominant religion of the Western world? Hart proposes the answer to this question after taking many pages at the beginning of the chapter to sermonize on the elusive, mutable nature of history, our views of which can be altered by romantic nostalgia or self-congratulatory reflections on how far we've come. Finally, he comes to his main point, his thesis, if there is such a thing for this chapter. Quote, "The gods required our sacrifices, and in return they preserved us from the very forces they personified and granted us some measure of their power. The dimensions of such a world were not perhaps as spacious as we might sometimes like to imagine in long retrospect. There was precious little hope for the average person in this world or beyond it." And Hart goes on to say, quote, "The late antique world within which Christianity arose was, if religion is any indicator, more than a little burdened by a sort of cosmic disenchantment, and the spiritualities it incubated within itself were pervaded by a profound and almost desperate otherworldliness. Not only is it wrong, in fact, to say that Christianity imported a prejudice against the senses into the pagan world, one should really say that if the Christianity of the early centuries was marked by any excessive anxiety regarding the material world or life in the body, this was an attitude that had migrated from pagan culture into the church. So it was into this atmosphere of spiritual despair that Christianity was born and took root and grew. And it was this yearning for escape and salvation that Christianity was able to satisfy in the minds of believers. This cosmic disquiet, as Hart calls it, not only encouraged the growth of Christianity, but it shaped the internal development of the Christian faith itself. For example, he cites the emergence of the Gnostics, who believed that the God who created the world was not the supreme God of the universe, but an evil false god, sometimes thought to actually be the God Yahweh from the Old Testament, and who saw the world as an inherently flawed creation, as opposed to mainstream Christians who viewed the world as the fallen creation of a benevolent and all-powerful God. Christians of the mainstream belief did not believe that the world was inherently wicked and evil and fallen. They did not believe it had been made that way originally. In its original pristine state, it was perfect, but it had been pulled down by sin and by evil. Gnosticism was a very diverse category of belief, but beneath much of it, Hart says, was the conviction that, quote, "somehow one is not truly at home in this world." And this sense of not belonging and the related desire to escape this world for a better one are found in many other mystery religions that existed in this same time period, which is the first few centuries after the life of Jesus. When Christianity entered this world, it brought glad tidings, the good news that the world and its people were not beyond redemption, that the world wasn't rotten from the beginning, but in its original form was beautiful and good. And someday, thanks to the work of Christ, it would return to that former pristine state. And everyone who trusted in the message of Christ would be able to enjoy it. All you had to do to reach that future restored world was to trust and have faith in the message of Christ as proclaimed by the church. And you were promised that one day you too could be a part of that better world. The true message of Christianity then, according to Hart, was not liberation from the flesh, but the hope of redemption of the flesh. Hart says, quote, "Whatever else Christianity brought into the late antique world, the principal gift it offered to pagan culture was a liberation from spiritual anxiety, from the desperation born of a hopeless longing for escape, from the sadness of having to forsake all love of the world absolutely in order to find salvation, from a morbid terror of the body, and from the fear that the cosmic powers on high might prevent the spirit from reaching its heavenly home. You know, I think quite a few Christians did not get the memo about the liberation from morbid terror of the body. But regardless, I'm glad to hear that Christianity brought some much needed comfort to people living more than 15 centuries ago. If it indeed gave people, particularly the poorest, most desperate people, a new way of looking at the world that made their lives feel less hopeless, that gave them something to look forward to, that's a good thing. What a shame that institutional Christianity, the powerful churches, particularly the Catholic Church that came to dominate the culture and politics of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, what a shame that that institution wasn't able to actually improve the lives of most of those people. Giving the destitute a hope for a better future is a fine thing, but it's also relatively easy to do when you know you'll never have to actually deliver on that promise. Even the sincerest, most devout, most well-meaning, least cynical priest that ever lived made promises on behalf of someone else. Another being, an all-powerful God who was going to take all the pain away, make all the suffering worthwhile, transform the sick and broken bodies of the faithful into ageless, impervious forms that would exist for a blissful eternity in a glorious, restored world. Christianity and all religions with theologies that include beliefs in an eternal paradise is predicated on humans making promises to other humans that they know they will not have to keep, because they aren't speaking for themselves. They're speaking for the church, and the church speaks for God. Hart sees this as an advantage. It's the reason that in a previous chapter he lamented the end of united Christendom and the loss of that ultimate authority once held in Europe by the church. But this is one of the things that bothers me the most about religion. Whether they are true believers or cynics playing on the hopes and fears of others, those who claim to speak for God are selling a product they will never have to deliver. So no, I'm not all that impressed when Hart describes the spiritual depression that pervaded Europe early in the first millennium, and then celebrates how Christianity was able to drive out that depression and replace it with hope and promises of a better future. The better future it promised didn't come until after those poor Christians were dead. If, indeed, it came at all, which sadly I don't think it did or ever will. You know what would impress me? You know what would really impress me? If, in addition to alleviating the spiritual angst felt by people, the church alleviated their physical suffering. Or if the church used its wealth and influence to drive reform in the secular governments, to promote social equality and economic justice and political representation of all people, regardless of how much money they had, or how much property they owned, or where they were from, or what language they spoke, or what gender they were, or what color their skin was, or what religion they believed in. The church has done all of those things, but only relatively recently, and only after being pushed in those directions by larger forces promoting social change. In Europe 1,500 years ago, was the Christian church helping the poor? Well, sure it was, here and there. Christian charity was a real thing, and I'm sure it did help many people, as it continues to help them today. But did the church devote its power and influence to advocate for reforming the very systems that created and maintained the conditions that made so many people suffer so greatly? Did the church follow the example of Jesus, its supposed founder and savior, and stand with the poor against the rich and powerful? Did the church, which Hart describes as this radical and transformative institution that was beholden to nothing else in this world, smash this corrupt and unjust social order and create a new society that valued people for their humanity rather than their property or their ability to sell their labor? The answer to all of these questions is no. The church didn't do any of that in late antiquity or the Middle Ages. The church treated the poor in much the same way Mother Teresa treated the sick who came to her at the missions of charity. It did nothing to alleviate their affliction in any meaningful way, but it told them their suffering was for a greater purpose and that things would be better for them when they were dead. Some may call that compassion. I call that cruelty. And I refuse to celebrate any institution that maintained and profited from such a system for centuries, while proclaiming itself to be a beacon of morality and charity. The Christian church had its shot to be a revolutionary force for good, real good, tangible good, good that would have immeasurably improved the lives of millions of people and changed its society irrevocably for the better. The church had over 1,000 years to do that, when it was an institution with power and influence unrivaled then or since, and it didn't. It chose to sell promises of a better life in the next world while exploiting the poor and the vulnerable to enlarge its own wealth in this world. And David Bentley Hart tells me I should be sad that this institution no longer has the same power in the modern world that it had in the world of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. No, sir. I am not sorry for that. I will not be sorry for that. Not in this life. Well, that's it for Chapter 11. That's it for this video. I will return in the next video in the series to cover the next 2 chapters of this book. Chapter 12, A Liberating Message, and Chapter 13, The Face of the Faceless. That's in the next video. That's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, please comment on this video. Let me know what I got right. Let me know what I got wrong. Let me know what your response is to what I have had to say, to what David Bentley Hart has had to say in these 2 chapters. If you are a Christian or an atheist or a believer or non-believer of any other stripe, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about what I've had to say. So please do leave a comment on this video. If you enjoyed this, if you find this to be of some use to you, don't forget to like and share and subscribe. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. I thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.